The night I lost everything started with an envelope nobody else cared about. The ballroom shimmered beneath a forest of crystal chandeliers, each one scattering warm golden light across polished marble floors that reflected the city skyline beyond the towering windows. From a distance it looked like a scene from a movie. Wealthy donors in designer gowns. Men in tailored suits laughing over glasses of champagne. A string quartet playing softly near the center fountain. But from where I stood, balancing a silver tray loaded with sparkling water and wine glasses, it looked like another 12-hour shift that my aching feet desperately wanted to end. My name is Emily Carter, and at 24 years old, I worked 3 jobs just to keep my mother's medical bills from swallowing us whole. Most nights, I served people whose watches cost more than my yearly rent. I'd learned to smile, keep my head down, and pretend their world didn't feel a million miles away from mine. The Grand Meridian Hotel hosted charity galas almost every month, and tonight's event was one of the biggest of the year. Hundreds of guests filled the ballroom, raising money for children's hospitals while wearing enough diamonds to fund one themselves. I moved carefully between tables, offering drinks and collecting empty glasses, trying not to think about how overdue my electric bill was. "Emily, table 14 needs service," my supervisor called from across the room. "On it," I answered, forcing another smile. As I crossed toward the far side of the ballroom, I noticed a little boy standing alone near one of the marble columns. He couldn't have been older than 8. His navy blazer hung awkwardly on his small frame, and tears glistened in his eyes. Around him, adults continued chatting and laughing, completely unaware. I slowed my pace. Something about the look on his face made it impossible to keep walking. "Hey there," I said gently as I approached. "Are you okay?" The boy looked up, his lower lip trembling. "I lost it." "Lost what?" His eyes darted around the room. "The envelope." I frowned. "What envelope?" "My mom gave it to me. She told me not to lose it." His voice cracked. "It had the money inside." My stomach tightened. "What kind of money?" "The donation." He swallowed hard. $5,000. $5,000. For most people in that room it was probably nothing. For me it sounded like a fortune. The boy's eyes filled with fresh tears. "She's gonna be so mad." I crouched beside him. "Okay. Take a breath. We'll find it." He nodded, though he clearly didn't believe me. For the next 20 minutes, I searched every corner of the ballroom. Under tables. Behind chairs. Near the registration desk. Nobody else seemed interested in helping. Most guests were too busy networking or taking photos. Several brushed past me without even noticing. The little boy followed closely behind, growing quieter with every passing minute. Finally, near the base of a decorative floral display beside the stage, I spotted a white envelope partially hidden beneath a curtain. My heart jumped. I reached down and picked it up. The seal was intact. The boy's eyes widened. "That's it." Relief flooded his face so suddenly that I almost laughed. "Looks like your night just got a whole lot better." He grinned for the first time. "Thank you." Together we walked across the ballroom until we found his mother speaking with a group of donors. The moment she saw the envelope in his hands, her expression transformed from panic to relief. She hugged him tightly before turning toward me. "You found it." "Just got lucky," I said. "No," she replied softly. "You were kind." Before I could respond, my supervisor's voice echoed from across the room. "Emily, back to work." I quickly nodded and stepped away. Another task. Another tray. Another long night. But as I returned to the crowd, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Somewhere across the ballroom, beyond the sea of glittering dresses and expensive suits, a man in a black suit sat alone in the VIP section. And though I didn't know it yet, that single lost envelope had already changed both of our lives. The orchestra shifted into a softer melody as the gala continued around me, but the warmth from helping that little boy faded quickly when I stepped back into reality. Reality looked a lot like my supervisor, Richard Bennett, standing near the service station with his arms folded and a look that could sour milk. The moment I approached, he grabbed the tray from my hands. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "A guest needed help," I explained. "The boy who lost the donation envelope. Your job is serving tables, Emily, not playing babysitter." I swallowed the response that immediately rose to my lips. Arguing with Richard never ended well. I was only trying to help. And while you were helping, table 21 waited 6 minutes for their drinks. 6 minutes. In a ballroom full of people who spent more time deciding between sparkling and still water than I spent eating dinner some nights. I am sorry, I said quietly. Richard shook his head. You always think rules do not apply to you. Before I could answer, another voice interrupted. Actually, I think she did exactly the right thing. We both turned. The woman whose son I had helped stood only a few feet away. Her elegant silver dress shimmered beneath the ballroom lights. My son told me everything, she continued. Your employee found $5,000 and returned it without hesitation. Richard immediately transformed. His rigid expression melted into a professional smile. Of course. We encourage exceptional service here at the Grand Meridian. I almost laughed. 5 seconds earlier, he had been ready to write me up. The woman thanked me again before returning to her table. Richard waited until she disappeared into the crowd before leaning closer. Do not get comfortable. The smile vanished. One compliment does not change your performance review. I nodded and returned to work. The next hour passed in a blur of champagne glasses, dinner plates, and polite smiles. My feet ached. My lower back burned. But I kept moving. That was what people like me did. We kept moving because stopping was not an option. Around 9 o'clock, a new group of guests arrived. They were wealthier than most of the people already attending. You could tell immediately. Not because of the clothes. Because of the way everyone else reacted when they entered. Conversations shifted. Hotel executives straightened their posture. Even Richard suddenly looked nervous. At the center of the group was a woman in her late 40s with flawless makeup and a diamond necklace that probably cost more than every car I had ever owned combined. Her name tag identified her as Victoria Sinclair. I recognized the name instantly. She owned one of the largest luxury retail companies in the country. Table 7, Richard whispered to the staff. Perfect service. No mistakes. Naturally, I was assigned to that table. By the time I approached with their drinks, Victoria was already complaining about something. The lighting. The seating arrangement. The wine selection. Nothing seemed good enough. I carefully placed a glass in front of her. Your sparkling water, ma'am. She barely glanced at me. Then her eyes drifted downward. Not to my face. To my shoes. My stomach tightened. They were clean. Polished. But old. I had owned them for nearly 3 years. Victoria's gaze lingered for a second too long. Interesting, she said. One of the women beside her looked down as well. What? Victoria smiled fondly. Nothing. I was just wondering how selective this hotel is with its staff these days. Heat climbed into my cheeks. I knew that tone. I had heard it my entire life. The tone people used when they wanted everyone in the room to know exactly where they believed you belonged. I finished serving the table and walked away. But 20 minutes later, I noticed Victoria speaking privately with Richard near the ballroom entrance. Both of them glanced in my direction. Richard nodded several times. Victoria smiled. And for the first time that evening, the uneasy feeling that had followed me all night settled heavily in my chest. Somewhere across the ballroom, the man in the black suit remained seated in the VIP section. His expression never changed. But his eyes followed every part of the conversation. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. People glanced at me all the time during events like this. Some were polite. Some were curious. Some looked through me as if I were part of the furniture. But the feeling sitting in my chest was different. Victoria Sinclair had not looked at me with curiosity. She had looked at me like a problem that needed to be removed. The ballroom grew louder as the evening continued. Dessert service began. Waiters moved between tables carrying plates decorated with tiny works of edible art that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I focused on work. Smile. Serve. Repeat. That was the safest strategy. Yet every time I passed near table 7, I felt Victoria's attention following me. Once I caught her whispering something to another guest while looking directly at me. Both women laughed softly. My stomach tightened. I knew that laugh too. It was the laugh people used when they believed someone did not belong in the same room. Around 10 o'clock, Richard appeared beside me again. His expression was stiff, forced, uncomfortable. None of those qualities were good signs. "Emily," he said quietly, "come with me." My pulse quickened. Now. Now. I handed my tray to another server and followed him through a side corridor that connected the ballroom to the administrative offices. The moment the music faded behind the closed doors, the silence felt heavy. Richard stopped near a small conference room. Victoria Sinclair stood inside speaking with two members of hotel management. The instant she saw me, her smile returned. I wished it had not. "There she is," Victoria said. "The waitress." Something about the way she said waitress made it sound insulting. One of the executives cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, please have a seat." I remained standing. Did I do something wrong? Nobody answered immediately. That silence was answer enough. Victoria folded her hands neatly on the table. "I simply had concerns." "Concerns?" I repeated. "About image." My confusion deepened. "I do not understand." "This hotel represents excellence," she explained. "Luxury, prestige, reputation." Her eyes moved briefly toward my shoes again. "Certain standards matter." The room suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. Richard looked away. The executive beside him adjusted his tie. Nobody defended me. Nobody questioned what was happening. Victoria continued speaking as though she were discussing table linens rather than a person. "Some guests become uncomfortable when employees do not reflect the atmosphere being presented." My face burned. "Because I am poor?" The words escaped before I could stop them. For the first time, Victoria's smile vanished. Not because she felt guilty, because I had said the quiet part out loud. Nobody answered. They did not have to. The silence told me everything. I thought about my mother sitting in a hospital bed 3 nights earlier. I thought about the extra shifts I had worked, the rent payment due next week, the bus rides, the second-hand clothes, the years spent trying to prove that hard work mattered more than where you came from. None of it seemed to matter inside that room. Finally, the executive spoke. "Miss Carter, perhaps it would be best if you returned to the ballroom for now." Returned. Not reassured. Not defended. Returned. Like the discussion was not already decided. I nodded once and walked toward the door. My hand was on the handle when Victoria spoke again. "Presentation matters." I paused. "Character matters more." The words left my mouth before fear could stop them. Then I opened the door and walked away. As I entered the ballroom again, my heart hammered against my ribs. Across the crowded room, the man in the black suit remained seated in the VIP section. For the first time all evening, our eyes met. And somehow, I had the strange feeling that he had heard far more than anyone realized. The rest of the evening felt different after that. Not because anything obvious had changed. The music still floated through the ballroom. Guests still laughed over expensive desserts. Crystal glasses still clinked beneath the chandeliers. But I could feel tension building beneath the polished surface of the night, like a storm hiding behind clear skies. I threw myself into work because it was the only thing I could control. One table needed coffee. Another requested fresh linens. A donor wanted directions to a private reception upstairs. Task after task kept my hands busy even when my thoughts refused to settle. Around 10:30, Richard suddenly approached the service station carrying an expression I had never seen before. Nervous. Very nervous. "Emily," he said, "take this to the VIP section." He handed me a small silver tray. Sitting in the center was a black leather watch box. I frowned. "What is it?" "A guest left it behind." "Then why not have security return it?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Because the owner is still here." Something felt strange immediately. Expensive items were usually handled by management, not waitresses. Especially not waitresses management had spent the entire evening criticizing. "Who does it belong to?" I asked. Richard glanced toward the VIP area. "Table 1. My eyes followed his gaze. Table 1. The man in the black suit. The same man who had watched the ballroom all night without speaking much. The same man whose eyes somehow seemed to notice everything. "Just return it," Richard said quickly. "And be careful." I picked up the tray and crossed the ballroom. The closer I moved toward the VIP section, the quieter everything seemed to become. Guests still talked. Servers still moved between tables. Yet the atmosphere around table 1 felt different. Controlled. Deliberate. Powerful. The man sat alone now. Several chairs around him remained empty. He looked out toward the ballroom through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan's glittering skyline. From this distance I noticed details I had missed before. Dark hair. Broad shoulders. An expensive black suit tailored perfectly. Calm confidence that did not need attention to announce itself. I stopped beside the table. "Excuse me, sir." His eyes lifted toward mine. Calm. Observant. Impossible to read. "You left this behind." I placed the watch box on the table. He glanced at it briefly, then back at me. Did I? The question caught me off guard. I was told it belonged to you. He studied me for a moment. And if it did? Then I wanted to make sure it was returned. A faint smile appeared, barely visible, gone almost immediately. Most people would have opened it first. I shook my head. It is not mine. You never wondered what was inside? Not really. That answer seemed to interest him more than anything else. He leaned back slightly in his chair. Do you always return things that do not belong to you? I thought about the envelope from earlier. The frightened little boy. My mother teaching me honesty when I was young. Yes, I said simply. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he opened the watch box. Inside rested a luxury watch that probably cost more than everything I owned combined. Diamonds reflected tiny flashes of light across the polished table. He closed the box again. Thank you, Miss Carter. My heart skipped. You know my name? Another small smile. The Grand Meridian employs many people. You happen to stand out. Before I could ask what that meant, a man in a dark suit approached from behind him and leaned down to whisper something quietly. The stranger listened without changing expression. Then he nodded once. The man stepped away. When the stranger looked back at me, something had shifted in his eyes. Not colder, sharper, more focused. You should get back to work, he said. It is going to be a very interesting night. His words stayed with me long after I walked away. It is going to be a very interesting night. I told myself they meant nothing. Just a polite comment from an important guest. Yet something about the way he had said it made me uneasy. The ballroom seemed brighter than before, louder too. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Silverware clinked against fine china. Somewhere near the stage, a donor was giving a speech about compassion and opportunity. The irony almost made me smile. Compassion was easy when cameras were watching. Opportunity was easy when you were born with it. I was carrying a tray of coffee cups toward the rear section of the ballroom when Richard appeared again. This time he did not bother pretending to be friendly. Conference room. Now. Several nearby employees glanced in my direction. My stomach dropped. There was something different in his voice. Final. Cold. The kind of tone people used when a decision had already been made. I followed him through the ballroom. Every step felt heavier than the last. Inside the conference room the same faces waited. Richard. 2 hotel executives. Victoria Sinclair. The moment I entered, nobody invited me to sit down. Nobody offered an explanation. Victoria folded her arms and studied me like an unpleasant stain on expensive fabric. Miss Carter, one executive began. Concerns have been raised regarding your professionalism. My pulse quickened. Professionalism. Several guests have reported discomfort. What guests? I asked. Nobody answered. Victoria simply looked away as though she had already won. I have done my job all night, I said carefully. If there is a specific complaint, I would like to hear it. Richard sighed dramatically. This attitude is exactly the problem. My hands tightened at my sides. What attitude? You constantly challenge authority. The accusation was so ridiculous that for a second I could not speak. I worked double shifts, covered weekends, filled in for absent employees. I had never even received a formal warning. Yet suddenly they were acting as if I were a problem employee. The executive cleared his throat. The Grand Meridian maintains certain standards. There it was again. Standards. A word that sounded respectable until you realized how people used it. Standards. Image. Presentation. They were different ways of saying the same thing. People like me made wealthy people uncomfortable. Victoria finally spoke. Luxury depends on perception. I looked directly at her. And honesty depends on character. Her expression hardened. Richard immediately stepped forward. That is enough. The room fell silent. Then the executive slid a folder across the table. Miss Carter, effective immediately, your employment with the Grand Meridian is terminated. For a moment the words did not feel real. They floated in the air between us. Weightless. Meaningless. Then reality hit all at once. My mother's medication. Rent. Bills. The second job that barely covered groceries. Every calculation I lived with every day rushed through my mind. Still I refused to let them see me break. I picked up the termination papers and stared at them quietly. So this is really happening. Nobody responded. Because they knew exactly what they were doing. Richard pointed toward the door. Please surrender your employee badge. Slowly, I unclipped the badge from my uniform. 24 months of early mornings and late nights. Reduced to a piece of plastic resting in my hand. I placed it on the table. No tears. No pleading. No argument. If they wanted humiliation, I would not give it to them. I turned and walked toward the door. As it opened, the sound of the gala rushed back into the hallway. Music. Conversation. Applause. The celebration continued as if nothing had happened. But when I stepped into the ballroom, dozens of eyes turned toward me. And standing near the VIP section, the man in the black suit had risen from his chair. For a second, the entire ballroom seemed to pause. The orchestra continued playing, glasses still clinked in the distance, and conversations carried on around the room, but all of it felt far away. I stood there holding the termination papers while dozens of strangers pretended not to stare. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. A few looked satisfied. I recognized that expression too. It was the look people wore when they believed someone had been put back in their place. My chest felt tight, but I kept walking. One step. Then another. My black shoes tapped softly against the marble floor as I crossed the ballroom for what I assumed would be the last time. I refused to rush. I refused to cry. My mother used to tell me that dignity was the one thing nobody could take unless you handed it away yourself. Tonight it was all I had left. I reached the edge of the ballroom where the service entrance led toward the employee lockers. That was when I heard a voice behind me. Miss Carter. The voice was calm, deep, controlled. I stopped. Slowly I turned around. The man from the VIP section was standing several feet away. Up close he looked even more intimidating than before. Not because he was loud or aggressive. Quite the opposite. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to prove who he was. Every person around him seemed to instinctively move aside. His dark suit looked flawless beneath the ballroom lights. His expression revealed almost nothing. Can I help you? I asked. He glanced at the papers in my hand. I believe they just made a mistake. I almost laughed. The absurdity of the statement caught me off guard. No, I said softly. They were very deliberate about it. Something flickered briefly in his eyes. Not surprise. Not sympathy. More like confirmation. As though he had expected exactly that answer. What are you going to do now? He asked. The question sounded genuine. Not polite conversation. Genuine curiosity. I looked down at the termination papers. Find another job. That's simple. Not simple. I forced a small smile. Necessary. For a moment neither of us spoke. The noise of the gala drifted around us. Somewhere behind him, Victoria Sinclair laughed at something one of her companions said. The sound carried farther than she probably intended. His eyes shifted briefly toward the table where she sat before returning to me. You are not angry? He asked. I considered the question carefully. Angry was too small a word for what I felt. Hurt. Embarrassed. Frightened. Exhausted. Yet anger was not what sat heaviest inside me. I am disappointed, I admitted. There is a difference. His gaze remained steady. Most people would have fought. Fought for what? I asked. A place where they already decided I do not belong? The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. Not quite approval. But something close. Interesting. Before I could respond, a man in a dark suit approached him quickly and whispered something in his ear. The stranger listened without interrupting. Then he nodded once. The other man immediately stepped away. The stranger looked back at me. "Go home, Miss Carter." I frowned. "That is your advice?" No, for the first time all evening, a genuine smile appeared. Small, brief, dangerous in its confidence. That is a promise that tomorrow will look very different from tonight. I stared at him, unsure what that meant. But before I could ask, he turned and walked back toward the center of the ballroom. Guests moved aside instinctively as he passed. Hotel executives suddenly straightened their posture. Even Richard looked nervous. And for the first time since losing my job, I had the strange feeling that the story was not ending. It was only beginning. I should have left. Every practical thought in my head told me to grab my coat, call a rideshare, and start figuring out how I was going to pay next month's bills. Instead, I stopped near the employee entrance and looked back one last time. The ballroom had changed. Not visibly at first. The chandeliers still glowed. The orchestra still played. Guests still moved between tables carrying glasses of wine and plates of dessert. Yet something in the atmosphere felt different. Tighter. More alert. The man in the black suit walked calmly toward the center of the room, and wherever he went, conversations seemed to quiet. I watched one of the hotel executives nearly jog across the ballroom to intercept him. Another appeared seconds later. Then another. None of them looked relaxed. Richard certainly did not. My former supervisor stood near the stage with the expression of a man who had just received unexpected news. Curious despite myself, I remained where I was. The stranger stopped near the main donor table. Victoria Sinclair immediately stood to greet him. Her smile was polished and confident. The kind of smile wealthy people practiced in mirrors. She extended her hand. He shook it once. Briefly. Then he said something I could not hear. Whatever it was, her smile disappeared. My pulse quickened. Around them, several executives exchanged nervous glances. One man reached for a napkin and dabbed sweat from his forehead. Another adjusted his tie for what looked like the 10th time in 5 minutes. The stranger remained perfectly calm. He never raised his voice. Never made a dramatic gesture. Yet somehow he controlled the entire room. A few minutes later, a woman from hotel administration hurried toward Richard carrying a tablet. I watched his face lose color as he read whatever appeared on the screen. "No," he said sharply. Even from across the ballroom I could read his lips. "That cannot be right." The woman handed the tablet to another executive. He stared at it, then stared toward the stranger, then looked back at the screen again. Suddenly I understood something important. This was not about reputation. This was not about influence. This was about power. Real power. The kind that did not need introductions. The kind that arrived quietly and changed everything. Guests had started noticing the tension too. Conversations slowed. Curious looks spread throughout the ballroom. Victoria Sinclair attempted to regain control of the evening by laughing and addressing a nearby group of donors, but nobody seemed interested anymore. Their attention kept drifting back toward the stranger. Then the hotel's chief operating officer appeared carrying a folder. He approached the stranger with both hands. Respectfully, almost carefully, the stranger opened the folder, signed something, closed it again. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet when it ended, several executives looked as though the floor had vanished beneath them. Richard stumbled backward into a chair. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew one thing. It involved the stranger. And somehow, impossibly, it involved tonight. My heart pounded as I watched him turn toward the ballroom. His gaze moved slowly across the crowd before settling on me near the employee entrance. For a moment, everything else seemed to disappear. The music. The conversations. The noise. Then he gave a single nod. Not a greeting. Not a farewell. A confirmation. As though a decision had finally become official. And the instant he did, the chief operating officer stepped onto the stage, reached for the microphone, and announced that there was an important update regarding the ownership of the Grand Meridian Hotel. The ballroom fell silent so quickly that the sudden absence of noise felt louder than the orchestra had moments before. Hundreds of guests turned toward the stage. Crystal glasses froze halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the musicians stopped playing. The chief operating officer adjusted the microphone with visibly shaking hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, forcing a smile that convinced absolutely nobody, "thank you for joining us this evening. Before we conclude tonight's event, there is an important announcement regarding the future of the Grand Meridian." My pulse quickened. Around the room, guests exchanged curious glances. The stranger remained standing near the center of the ballroom, calm and composed as if he already knew every word that was about to be spoken. "Earlier this evening," the executive continued, "the final phase of a private acquisition was completed." A murmur swept through the crowd. "Effective immediately, ownership of the Grand Meridian Hotel and Resort Group has officially transferred to Romano Capital Holdings." The room erupted into whispers. Several executives lowered their heads. Others stared toward the stranger. My breath caught. Romano. Suddenly everything made sense. The confidence. The authority. The way powerful people seemed nervous around him. He was not an important guest. He was something far bigger. The executive swallowed hard before continuing. "Please join me in welcoming the new owner and chairman, Mr. Alexander Romano." Applause began slowly, then spread throughout the ballroom. Alexander Romano. For the first time I finally had a name. He stepped forward without rushing, without smiling, without acknowledging the attention surrounding him. He accepted the microphone from the executive and looked across the room. The silence returned immediately. "Thank you for being here tonight," he said. His voice was calm but carried effortlessly through the ballroom. "I have always believed that businesses reveal their true character through the way they treat people." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Buildings matter. Reputation matters. Profit matters. His eyes swept across the crowd. But character matters more. My stomach tightened. Those were almost the exact words I had spoken earlier. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Victoria Sinclair looked suddenly less confident than she had all evening. Alexander continued. "This evening I witnessed acts of generosity, integrity, and kindness." His gaze drifted briefly toward me. I also witnessed something else. The room grew even quieter. I witnessed people being judged for circumstances rather than character. Victoria's expression hardened. Richard stared at the floor. Alexander remained completely composed. "As owner, I intend to build an organization that rewards honesty, professionalism, and dignity. Not status. Not wealth. Not appearances. More silence." Then came the moment. Nobody expected. "Therefore," Alexander said, "effective immediately, several management positions within this property are being terminated pending review." Audible gasps spread through the ballroom. Richard looked as though he might faint. One executive nearly dropped his glass. Victoria's face lost all color. Alexander handed the microphone back to the chief operating officer. The announcement was over. Simple. Direct. Final. Yet the consequences rippled through the room instantly. Guests whispered excitedly. Executives rushed toward one another in panic. Staff members stared in disbelief. Through all of it, Alexander turned and began walking toward the exit. Halfway there he stopped beside me. "Miss Carter." My heart hammered. "Yes. I told you tomorrow would look different." Then, with the faintest hint of a smile, he continued toward the doors, leaving behind a ballroom full of powerful people suddenly discovering that power could change hands far faster than they ever imagined. I did not sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes I saw the ballroom, the chandeliers, the shocked expressions. Alexander Romano standing calmly, while an entire room full of powerful people realized the rules had changed. By morning reality returned. Rent was still due. My mother still needed medication. Losing a job did not become less frightening just because wealthy people had experienced an uncomfortable evening. I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria before visiting my mother when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Normally I ignored unknown calls, but something made me answer. "Hello. Miss Carter." The voice was professional. "This is Daniel Brooks from Romano Capital Holdings. Mr. Romano would like to meet with you." I nearly dropped my coffee. 2 hours later, I found myself standing inside a conference room overlooking Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched toward the skyline. The furniture probably cost more than my car. Yet somehow the room felt less intimidating than the ballroom had. Alexander sat at the far end of the table reviewing documents. When he looked up, he immediately closed the folder. "Thank you for coming." I was curious, I admitted. Most people would be. He gestured toward a chair. "Please sit." I did. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Alexander slid a thin folder across the table. "What is this?" "An opportunity." I opened it carefully. The first page displayed plans for a new charitable foundation focused on job training, education grants, and family assistance programs. My confusion deepened. "I do not understand." "The foundation needs leadership," he said. "People who understand struggle without becoming bitter because of it." I stared at him. "There must be hundreds of qualified candidates." "There are." His expression remained calm. "But qualifications are easy to find. Character is harder." My throat tightened unexpectedly. Nobody had ever described me that way before. Most people notice my old shoes, my bank account, my circumstances. Alexander had noticed something else. "Why me?" I asked quietly. He leaned back slightly. "You returned an envelope with $5,000 when nobody was watching. You returned an expensive watch without opening the box. You lost your job and walked away with dignity instead of anger." His gaze remained steady. "That tells me more than any resume." For several seconds I could not speak. The room blurred slightly as emotion threatened to overwhelm me. Not because of the offer itself. Because someone had finally seen value in me before seeing my circumstances. Alexander pushed the folder closer. "I am not offering charity, Miss Carter." "Then what are you offering?" A faint smile appeared. "A future." The words settled between us. Simple. Honest. Real. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Hope. When I left the building later that afternoon, the city looked different. The streets were the same. The traffic was the same. My problems had not magically disappeared. Yet somehow the weight felt lighter. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, my phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. My mother's latest test results were improving. I laughed softly and looked up at the sky. The night before, I had walked out of a ballroom believing my future had collapsed. Instead, it had quietly opened a different door. Sometimes losing the thing you thought you needed is the only way to find the thing you truly deserve. And sometimes the people who change your life do not notice your uniform. They notice your character.